The first light of dawn stretched across the desert plains, painting the sky in streaks of crimson and gold. Red Rock, a town built on grit and dust, lay silent in the early hours. Not a horse stirred in the stables. Not a door creaked open. The townsfolk knew what this morning meant. It was not the promise of a new day, it was the shadow of reckoning. On the outskirts of town, a lone rider tightened the reins of his worn-out horse. Carter Hayes, a name whispered in saloons, feared by outlaws and remembered by widows. He wasn't always a gunfighter. Once he was a rancher, a man of soil and sweat who dreamed of building a life under the wide Texas sky. But dreams die quick when bullets fly, and Carter had lost everything to them: a burned homestead, a wife buried too young, and a heart turned cold. Now all that remained was the weight of a revolver at his side, and the justice only steel could deliver. The townsfolk watched from behind shuttered windows, their breaths shallow, their prayers quiet. Every step of Carter's boots echoed down the empty street, each one heavier than the last. The sheriff, a weary man who'd seen too much blood, stood on the porch of his office, hat pulled low. He didn't speak, didn't stop him. Some men couldn't be stopped. Some destinies couldn't be undone. The saloon's swinging doors creaked in the breeze, the scent of whiskey and tobacco drifting out. Inside sat the man Carter had come for. A rustler, a killer, the last thread in the noose of Carter's vengeance. But before bullets flew, there was a moment, a silence so heavy it pressed against the chest, a silence that told everyone in Red Rock that this was no ordinary morning. This was a dawn that would end with death. As the sun climbed higher, the shadows grew shorter. Carter stepped into the center of the street, hand resting on the handle of his gun. He raised his eyes to the horizon, the light catching the scars on his face, and in that moment he knew. Whether he lived or died, this ride, this morning, this Gunsmoke at dawn, would be his last. They called him Carter Hayes. To some he was a savior, to others a ghost of vengeance. Every man who crossed his path carried a story, and most of those stories ended with the echo of a gunshot. Once, long ago, Carter had no taste for blood. He was a rancher, a man who knew the rhythm of the earth better than the sound of a pistol. Dawn meant branding cattle, mending fences, and watching the sun climb over rolling fields. But the Wild West was not a land that allowed peace for long. Outlaws came one night, drunk on power, greedy for land, and with them came fire. His ranch burned to the ground, his family buried in the ashes. Carter learned then what the frontier truly demanded: survival by the gun. Years passed, and his name spread from Dodge City to Abilene. Some said he hunted men for money. Others swore he hunted them for the thrill. The truth was far simpler. Carter carried a debt in his soul that could never be repaid. Each outlaw he sent to the grave was a ghost he thought he buried with his family. But ghosts never rest easy. Now as he rode into Red Rock, that burden weighed heavier than the iron strapped to his hip. Children hid behind their mothers when they caught sight of him. Men lowered their eyes as if afraid that meeting his gaze would seal their fate. Carter didn't blame them. He had become something less than a man, more than a myth, a shadow cast across the desert plains. And yet, beneath the scars, beneath the cold steel of his resolve, there was still a trace of the rancher he used to be. When he saw a boy running barefoot through the dust, it reminded him of a son he once hoped to raise. When the church bell rang at dusk, he thought of the wife who had once prayed for his safety. These fleeting memories haunted him more than any gunfight ever could. Carter Hayes rode not for glory nor for coin. He rode because he could not stop, because the burden of a man who has lost everything is not silence, but the endless search for justice in a world that knows none. And so under the burning sun of Red Rock, Carter's burden followed him like a shadow, and the town braced itself for the storm he carried at his side. By noon, Red Rock was a town of shadows. Curtains drawn, doors barred, the streets emptied like a graveyard at dusk. Even the wind seemed to hush, carrying only the dry rattle of dust down the main road. Every soul knew what was coming. A duel, a reckoning, a moment when time itself would hold its breath. Carter Hayes stood at the edge of the street, his boots planted firm in the dirt. His eyes narrowed beneath the brim of his hat, the sun glinting off the scar that ran across his cheek. Across from him, inside the saloon, sat the man who had poisoned the town with fear. Jeb Malone, outlaw, thief, and murderer. He had taken lives without thought, carved his power into Red Rock through cruelty, and laughed at the law. But Carter wasn't the law. He was something far colder, far more certain. He was the end of the line. The sheriff leaned against the rail outside his office, jaw clenched, hands twitching near his belt. He wanted to step in, to stop it before it began, but he knew better. This was bigger than lawmen and jails. This was justice the way the frontier wrote it, with iron and blood. Inside the saloon, Jeb pushed through the doors, spurs jingling, his grin twisted with arrogance. The outlaw's hand hovered near his holster, fingers twitching like a snake ready to strike. The street was now their arena, the whole town their witness. Mothers clutched their children tighter behind shuttered windows. Old men whispered prayers into trembling hands. Every heartbeat in Red Rock pounded in rhythm with the ticking of the clock above the general store. Carter's gaze never wavered. He saw the outlaw, but he also saw every ghost that had driven him here. His wife, his son, his burned home, the countless graves of men who thought they could outrun judgment. His hand rested lightly on the worn grip of his revolver, steady as stone, calm as the dawn. This was not anger. This was inevitability. The world narrowed to two men, two guns, one breath. A hush deeper than silence fell upon Red Rock. Even the wind dared not move. The stage was set, the tension drawn tight as a bowstring. And when it snapped, only one man would walk away. The world held its breath. The sun hung heavy above Red Rock, baking the street into hard clay. Two men stood facing each other, hands hovering over steel, their shadows long and sharp against the dust. For a moment nothing moved. Not the wind, not the clock above the store, not even the lungs of the people watching from behind shuttered windows. Time itself seemed to wait for the first shot. Jeb Malone smirked, his teeth yellowed, his voice dripping with mockery. "You're a dead man, Hayes. Just another ghost to bury in this dirt." His words fell like rattlesnake venom, but Carter Hayes didn't flinch. His eyes, cold and unwavering, were fixed on the outlaw. He had heard 1,000 threats before. They all ended the same way. Then it came, the twitch of a hand, the flash of metal, the thunder of gunfire. In less than a heartbeat, the silence was torn apart. Two pistols roared, spitting flame and smoke into the blistering air. The crack echoed off wooden walls, rattled windows, sent horses rearing in their pens. The duel had begun. Carter's revolver bucked in his grip, steady and precise, each shot a piece of judgment delivered. Jeb stumbled back, firing wildly, his bullet splintering posts and shattering glass. The crowd, hidden but watching, gasped with every near miss, every bullet that found its mark in the earth. For a few chaotic seconds, the street was filled with nothing but smoke, fire, and the acrid stench of powder. When the haze began to clear, Carter stood tall, his chest rising slow, steady, deliberate. Across from him, Jeb staggered, clutching his side, his bravado bleeding away with the crimson soaking his shirt. He raised his pistol one last time, desperation in his eyes. But Carter was faster. His final shot rang out like thunder rolling across the plains. Jeb Malone collapsed into the dirt, his grip loosening, his weapon falling useless by his side. The smoke drifted upward, curling toward the sky, carrying with it the weight of death and destiny. For Carter Hayes, the moment was not victory, it was inevitability. Gunsmoke hung thick in the air, and in that haze, the cowboy's story was carved into the history of Red Rock. One man left standing. One legend born in fire and dust. Do you want me to finishing? The gunfire had faded, but its echo lingered across Red Rock like a haunting hymn. Dust slowly settled over the street, mixing with the acrid curl of smoke that drifted upward toward the noon sun. Jeb Malone lay motionless in the dirt. His reign of terror ended, his laughter silenced forever. The outlaw's name would be remembered, but only as a shadow swallowed by justice. The real story, the one etched into the heart of Red Rock, was that of Carter Hayes. Carter stood in the center of the street, revolver lowered, his chest rising slow with each breath. Around him the silence was heavy, broken only by the distant whinny of horses and the creak of wooden shutters as townsfolk peeked out. Mothers held their children close, fathers removed their hats, and the sheriff gave a solemn nod. They all knew what they had witnessed. Not just a duel, but the passing of a man into legend.